people think were undertaken just by the military were actually efforts that where State Department and CIA folks were very, very involved. You couldn't have tracked down Osama bin Laden without the help of a lot of non-military federal employees. And we're reminding them when they're talking about cutting pensions, they're talking about cutting the pensions of folks who were part of the effort to track down and get Osama bin Laden. And again, on Capitol Hill, you just kind of have to try and go right to the point. But I think it's part of the larger story about how we have we should have an integrated approach to our national security. And that leads me to your question on the budget. So if you're thinking about a national security budget, it makes sense, obviously, to look at all the different pieces together. I mean, part of our conversation here has been that the work done by the Foreign Service, whether it's in diplomacy or development, is part of an overall strategy we have to engage and try and influence events around the world. And if you look at it in that context, you would say, well, let's look at that budget as a whole. And if people listen to people like Secretary Gates and Secretary Panetta, when you look at it that way, you'd say, well, maybe it's more cost effective to spend a little bit more on diplomacy and development. And so that, at least conceptually, for people who follow these issues closely, that's a good thing and could be a positive thing from the budget perspective. Now, on the downside, anytime Foreign Service and State Department gets lumped into the same category as the Defense Department, there are some that would prefer to focus on just the military aspect of our national security. And in that competition, it's possible that the State Department would come out on the shorter end of the stick. However, I should say that if it's also not a great place to be where you're competing with education. In other words, if you're not in the national security bucket, you're in the rest of the budget, and then the question is, do you want to fund, this piece of the budget, including, international affairs, development assistance overseas, versus investing in communities here at home. And so that's not an easy place to be either, just in terms of the political dynamics of the budget. So, yeah, I think either way, the key is to go back to your earlier questions. We just need to, build a better appreciation of the work done by Foreign Service and the fact that we have a multifaceted security strategy. I would just make one sort of almost technical point, which is the way the budget works for that 2-year period. So for fiscal years 2011 and the current fiscal year, we had the national security bucket. Actually, beginning of fiscal year 2013, we're off of that. We're back to having, if the sequester, for example, were to take effect, then you're going into a world where it's just Defense Department, what we call the 050 account, and everything else. And in fact, the firewall that was in place was only in place for 2 fiscal years. So we're already out of this world where you have national security as one part of the budget, the other. And we may end up going back to that world, and if you ever did, a major foreign assistance bill, and you really were looking at, we can all dream, or maybe not. I mean, maybe it's I was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee way back, and I think that's the last time. That's the last time when I was there. Was actually the last time I think we had may have been the last large foreign assistance bill. We did State Department authorization bills more frequently. Now we don't do those either. So, and it's because these issues get so political, and so everything ends up flowing through the appropriations subcommittee.
Well, that was going to be actually my next question. It's been a decade, as you mentioned, since Congress passed an authorization bill for the State Department and foreign affairs agencies. Since then, the state and foreign ops appropriations bill has become a vehicle for a host of issues and that now are fought over politically, as you say. Do you see a way forward for an authorization bill? Would it be a positive move or not in the short and medium term future? What has to change?
Well, not to be flip, but of course it does depend on what ends up being in them. And that's, you know, you could have a foreign assistance bill that sort of set out major contours and direction for foreign policy that I think could point us in the right direction. But you could, depending on the politics and how the debate worked out, you could have some things that got in there as a matter of permanent law that you didn't want. And so, you know, it's one of those, it all depends. I mean, you know, certainly if I could write a foreign assistance bill, and with the help of a lot of people in this room, I think we'd say it would be a net plus, because the old foreign assistance bill is, you know, it could be modernized. There's some, you know, I think if you talk to people like Senator Kerry, or you talk to people like Howard Berman, they both have ideas about how we could restructure some things that I think would be positive. But again, it's not any guarantee that the way they would envision this turning out would be the way it actually turned out. So again, it's unfortunate that these bills became sort of the Christmas trees that a lot of other things sort of get glommed onto. But for the time being, in this political environment, you know, my best advice is, you know, you don't necessarily want foreign assistance bill authorization, because you just don't know what it would look like, and it would be potentially risky to put some things in permanent law. You might regret later.
Well, the last area that we were going to turn to is benefits, and you spoke a little bit about those, you know, in the beginning, and I'm sure there'll be some questions from the floor. But, you know, the whole push to cut federal benefits seems to be based on an argument either that we can't afford them or that the federal employees don't deserve them, something in between. So, you know, I don't know if there's anything you want to add now on the thinking on this, whether 2013 is going to end up not as bad as some of the political rhetoric that suggests sort of, you know, repeating 2012.
Right.
Sounded worse, and in the end it wasn't as bad as some had feared. Is that sort of the scenario that you see playing out now in an election year, or not?
In terms of the agency budgets, you're talking about in terms of...
Either the agency
right.
budgets or the benefits.
So this is, I apologize in advance for a little bit of a long answer. So I'm going to answer the narrow part first, federal employee benefits, including those enjoyed by members of Congress and members of the Foreign Service. What's happened is you've got these dueling reports as to whether or not federal employees as a group are overcompensated or undercompensated relative to their private sector counterparts. And if you look at the reports by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you look at reports done by the Federal Salary Council, they would indicate that if you look at both salary and non-salary components of compensation, non-salary meaning health benefits and retirement benefits, that federal employees as a group are undercompensated compared to their private sector counterparts by on average as much as 26%. Now, the Congressional Budget Office recently completed a study that used a different methodology. And they came to the conclusion that on average, federal employees, when you look at salary and compensation, are overcompensated compared to their private sector counterparts. Now, let me say something about the methodology first. The Bureau of Labor Statistics methodology is to try to compare similar job responsibilities. Okay? So they try and pair up the responsibilities of somebody in the State Department with what they would say are the equivalent responsibilities of someone in the private sector. Now, the Foreign Service is obviously an especially difficult area, for example, to make that comparison. But let's take nurses, for example. A nurse that works for the Veterans Administration versus a nurse in another hospital. And they would try and compare similar responsibilities, and the Federal Salary Council might say, well, the nurse of someone in a veterans administration may, in addition to having normal nursing duties, may have some other duties, maybe not. Anyway, my point is, they're supposed to look at job responsibilities and see what the discrepancy, if any, in compensation is. The Congressional Budget Office just took a different approach. In fact, they were directed to take a different approach by those who requested them take the study. And so it is an example of, what you put in, dictates in large part the answer that you get out. But what they did is took just a strict demographic analysis. So they would look at people based on their educational background and their other demographic characteristics and compare that to other people in other jobs throughout the country with the same demographic and educational profile. And when you do the study that way without looking at job responsibilities, but just looking at, okay, how much did they have a high school degree? Did they have a college degree? Did they have a graduate degree? And you account for, obviously, different cost of living depending on where you work. Their calculation was, as I said, federal employees are paid more. Now, I should add that both methodologies show that federal employees with higher skill and educational levels are undercompensated compared to their private sector counterparts. And so let me be clear on that. Both studies showed, the Congressional Budget Office showed, as well as the Federal Salary Councils, that the higher the education of background of a federal employee in terms of college, graduate work, and other professional degrees, the more undercompensated the federal employee is. And all studies show that that cohort of individuals is underpaid and undercompensated compared to the private sector. And in Washington, I used to work at a law firm in Washington. Let me tell you, first-year associates do better than members of Congress. And so, that's a little. A couple years in, and you're doing very well. And it's the same with judges. Judges, Supreme Court judge, would be a multi-million-dollar partner. So so you can see when you're talking about, that cohort, and that includes, frankly, a lot of people in the Foreign Service. That fall in that category of being undercompensated compared to in the private sector. So that's sort of the impact on federal employees. Now, in terms of what will happen there, I don't know. I think given the fact we're working very hard to make sure that federal employees aren't singled out to pay for these kind of initiatives that we just saw before. And as I said, we were successful, at least in holding current federal employees harmless. Now, let me talk about agency budgets. The good news with the Budget Control Act that we entered into last cycle was we had a 2-year commitment, at least on overall spending levels for the federal government. And that includes the spending levels for this year, at least what we thought was a commitment. I'll give a minute to watch. So that provided a little what we thought was going to be some stability and predictability. And within that context, I think, the administration's budget, for example, the president's budget fits within that. And his budget for the State Department operations, it's not wildly ambitious, but it's steady as she goes. Now, in fiscal year 13, as we speak, there are discussions going on in the House with the Speaker of the House and others, because a lot of the Tea Party folks in the House don't want to live by the agreed ceilings. They want to go below the ceilings. This is, again, for overall budgets, but it obviously has an impact on everybody's budget. So if you cut significantly below the levels that were agreed to, then the appropriators have a much tighter budget to allocate, and you don't know where the chips will fall at the end of the day in the House. Now, again, the President's position, the Senate's position, and certainly the position of everybody who was part of that agreement was we expected there to be stable funding this year. So even if the House were to come under those budget numbers by the time you negotiate with the Senate and the White House, I would expect them to come up close to where they are now, but that's not a guarantee, and you could get into another battle over government shutdown, depending on how big a gap. We don't know what the Republican budget will be. In the House, we're scheduled to get it, not this coming week, but the week after next. That's when we're supposed to mark up, as we say, the House Republican budget in the Budget Committee, and the week after it will be on the floor of the House. So we don't know what they're going to do with those spending levels. Now, the next question has to do with sequester, right? Because the way the Budget Control Act was set up was that if the so-called super committee, and I call it the not-so-super committee, and it was an honor to serve on it, worked very hard to try and get an agreement that would reduce the deficit by $1.2 trillion in a reasonable and balanced way. We were unsuccessful in doing that, so that meant the clock started ticking towards sequester. That means that if between now and the end of this year, Congress does not come up with another way of reducing the deficit by $1.2 trillion, you will begin to see these across-the-board cuts take place in all federal agencies and programs that were not specifically exempted. Some areas were exempted. Medicaid was exempted. Some parts of the federal spending were exempted. But certainly federal agency budgets were not exempted. And the estimate is, depending on the agency, you're talking about another potentially up to 15–16% cut. That's a big cut. I mean, on top of the cuts that have taken place, that's a big cut. So, what has to happen in order to avoid that? Well, what has to happen, as I said, is there has to be some agreement between now and January 2nd of next year to replace that $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction with some other way of getting that same budget savings. Now, we can do that. The President's budget does that. The President submitted a budget that gets rid of the sequester because he reduces the deficit. He does it in a balanced way. He makes some program cuts. Some of his budget does, I mean, his budget did have a small increase in pension contributions for current federal employees. You probably know that. That was a little piece of his budget. But he took it to 1.2 from 0.8. But most of his budget has some cuts in other areas, but then he deals with the revenue piece, right? So he has about $1.6 trillion in net revenue increase. And when you put it all together, he gets more than $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction, but he does it in a balanced way. And you get rid of the sequester without doing any damage to federal agencies. They would be funded under that budget at about where they are now. It's a little. So the problem is that the Republican budget will also get rid of the sequester. They'll come up with more than $1.2 trillion, but they will get rid of the sequester partly by cutting much more deeply into federal agency budgets, by cutting into, education, science and research, infrastructure, and really dramatically cutting things like Medicaid, and then I don't know what they're going to do if they go to their Medicare voucher plan again or not. So, that's the challenge here. So here's what we can look forward to. There are one of two scenarios, right? Either you have a fiscal train wreck, or you have a confluence of events that forces responsible and productive action to reduce the deficit. I know. We can hope, though. We can hope, we can pray. So here are the three things. This is actually, I'm going to go on from there because this is important for everybody to know, not just as foreign service officers, but just as citizens. So three major events come to a head at the end of this year. One is all the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts expire, so all the so-called Bush tax cuts expire. Not just for very high income individuals, for everybody. The value of those tax cuts over 10 years is $5 trillion. Let me put it another way. If Congress packed its bags and went home and didn't come back till this time next year, you would reduce the deficit compared to current policy by $5 trillion. That exceeds the Bowles-Simpson targets that include, okay? But I should hasten to add that those tax cuts include tax cuts that the president and others don't want to get rid of. I mean, it did some good things back then. It ended the marriage penalty. There was a child tax credit. So you'll be hard pressed to find people who want to get rid of all of them. I mean, there are some, all $5 trillion worth. But we can certainly, from my perspective, ask the folks at the very top to at least go back to what they were, the same rate they were paying during the Clinton administration. And you know, there's some other things we can do on the international corporate tax side and some other, you know, tax preferences that have no place in the tax code. So that's one thing that's going to happen. The other thing, as I said, is the sequester. That begins January 2nd of next year. The third thing that happens is we hit the debt ceiling again. Remember that last August? So it is now projected that we will actually hit the debt ceiling before the end of this year, probably after the election, but before the end of this year. Now, just as last time, the Secretary of the Treasury has some tools to be able to manage the accounts that prevent us from defaulting right away. And so the current projection is you could get to sometime maybe in February before you actually would default if you don't extend the debt ceiling. So this all happens in a period right after a major election in the country. And so you can see you've got quite a cocktail here, confluence of events. There are other things that have. We have something called the doc fix that was part of the most recent package. So just so you know what that means.